June 4, 1942, the Pacific Ocean. An American torpedo squadron, 15 planes, is flying straight toward the Japanese fleet. No fighter cover, no escort, no one above them and no one below. The Japanese Zeros find them before they get anywhere close. One by one, the planes go down, all 15. Not one torpedo reaches its target. Not one crew flies home. 9 days later, the captain of the carrier those men flew off signs his after-action report. He writes that his air group flew southwest, toward the enemy fleet. The surviving pilots, when they are asked, say the air group flew west, due west, into open ocean. One direction finds the Japanese fleet, the other finds nothing. That captain's name was Marc Mitscher. 2 years later, he would command the most powerful carrier task force in the history of the United States Navy. The pilots who served under him said they would fly into anything because they knew, whatever happened, he would find a way to bring them home. The same man who signed that report at Midway, the same handwriting, the same name. If that question is already sitting in your chest right now, go ahead and hit the like button. Not because this channel needs the number, but because the men in this story never once got their names in the headlines. That button is the smallest way left to say they still matter. This is not a story about a hero. It is not a story about a villain. It is a story about 3 decisions, and one man who never explained a single one of them. By the end of this video, you will have seen all 3. You will decide for yourself what kind of Admiral Marc Mitscher was. He graduated from the Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1910. Near the bottom of his class, more than 130 men graduated that year. Mitscher was close to the last of them. Before that, he had been thrown out, dismissed after accumulating more demerits than the Academy would tolerate. His father went to Washington personally and pushed until the Navy let his son back in. That is not how legends are supposed to start. He chose naval aviation in 1915, when naval aviation was barely a concept. The Navy had a handful of aircraft and no real doctrine for using them. Nobody could tell you with confidence what a carrier-based airplane was actually going to be worth in a war. Mitscher looked at that uncertainty and said that was where he wanted to be. In 1916, he became Naval Aviator number 33. 33 men in the history of the United States Navy had qualified before him. 3 years later, in May of 1919, he was sitting at the controls of a flying boat called the NC-1, one of 3 aircraft attempting the first transatlantic crossing by air. They left Newfoundland bound for the Azores, more than 1,200 miles across open Atlantic. No GPS, no modern instruments, a magnetic compass and the skill of the men flying. Near the Azores, the fog came in thick and low. Mitscher lost his horizon. He couldn't tell up from down. He brought the NC-1 down onto the surface of the ocean, and what had looked like calm water from altitude turned out to be heavy chop. The wings broke. The hull split open. Water started coming in. He and 5 crewmen climbed out onto the upper wing of the aircraft and sat there, in the fog, in the dark. The Atlantic moving beneath them, the plane settling lower with each wave. They waited 3 hours before a Greek cargo ship found them and pulled them out. The NC-4, the 3rd aircraft in the flight, made it all the way to Lisbon. The newspapers wrote about the men on that plane. Mitscher received a Navy Cross for the attempt. He did not talk much about that night on the wing. He never talked much about anything. Arleigh Burke served as Mitscher's chief of staff through the last 2 years of the Pacific War. The campaigns at the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Burke would go on to become the longest-serving chief of naval operations in American history. When people asked him about Mitscher, he would answer in one sentence. His flyers worshipped him. He didn't elaborate. Mitscher spoke in a near whisper. His staff had to lean in close to hear his orders. He sat in a swivel chair on the bridge of his flagship facing the stern, his back to the ocean, his long-billed baseball cap worn backward, his face looking down. Time magazine, writing about him in 1947, called it deceptive ease. He never used the word I when talking about a victory. Always we. When young pilots came aboard a Task Force 58 carrier for the first time, the veterans would tell them one thing about the Admiral: he'll bring you home. There is a specific kind of quiet that comes from a man who has already been lost at sea once and lived. You stop needing to announce yourself. The ocean already knows your name. The night before the battle, June 3, 1942. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron gathered the pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8 in the ready room of the USS Hornet. He had been flying with the United States Navy since 1927. He knew his aircraft, the DPD Devastator torpedo bomber, was already obsolete, too slow, too low, too easy for Zeros to catch. He knew there would be no fighter cover. He knew what the odds looked like. He handed each of his men a mimeographed sheet, the attack plan, and at the bottom, a personal note he had typed himself. The last lines read, "My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation, but if we don't, and the worst comes to the worst, I want each of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only one plane left to make the final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all. Good luck, happy landings, and give 'em hell." He handed out the sheets and sent his men to bed. At 7:05 the next morning, the Hornet and the Enterprise began launching aircraft. Commander Stanhope Ring, the Hornet's Air Group commander, led the strike force on a heading of 265 degrees, due west. The fighters ran low on fuel and had to ditch in the ocean without firing their guns at a single enemy plane. The dive bombers flew until they couldn't fly any further and turned back without dropping a single bomb. Not one pilot in the main Hornet Air Group saw a Japanese ship that morning. Waldron saw them. At some point over the open ocean, he broke away from Ring's formation. He had his own red on where the Japanese carriers were. He took his 15 planes down low over the water and flew toward the Japanese fleet alone. There was nothing between Torpedo 8 and the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. The Zerosos came down out of the sun. One plane went down, then another, then another. 30 men flew off the Hornet that morning with Waldron. One came back. Ensign George Gay was shot down, wounded, his radioman already dead beside him. He pulled himself out of the sinking cockpit and hid under a seat cushion, floating on the surface of the ocean. He lay there for more than 30 hours, unable to do anything but wait. While Gay was in the water, dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet. The Zeros had been pulled down low chasing the torpedo planes, Waldron's men, and the torpedo squadrons from the other carriers, all of them taking the same punishment. There was nothing left to stop the dive bombers coming from altitude. 3 Japanese carriers were struck within minutes of each other and began to burn. A fourth, the Hiryu, fought back, launched a counterstrike, and was not a hit until that evening. By the time the sun went down, all 4 were gone. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu. 4 of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor. Gone in an afternoon. The Battle of Midway changed the war. It is still considered the turning point of the entire Pacific. The Hornet's Air Group played no part in those 6 minutes. 9 days after the battle, on June 13, 1942, Captain Marc Mitscher signed the Hornet's official after-action report. He wrote that his air group had flown on a course of 239 degrees southwest toward the anticipated position of the Japanese fleet. A course consistent with what the senior commanders had planned, a course that, on paper, made tactical sense. There were no squadron commander reports attached, no supporting documentation. None of the other unit leaders had submitted their own accounts, just Mitscher's signature at the bottom. Admiral Spruance read the report. In his own official account of the battle, Spruance wrote a single line about the Hornet that historians have returned to ever since. Where discrepancies exist between Enterprise and Hornet reports, the Enterprise report should be taken as more accurate. That was all he wrote about it. He did not explain what the discrepancies were. He did not call for an investigation. Midway was a triumph, the kind of victory the country desperately needed, and no one in Washington was interested in pulling at the threads. Historians have been arguing about that report ever since. Some believe the course recorded in it was a deliberate misrepresentation. Others believe Mitscher had a tactical reason for the direction the air group flew that he chose not to put in writing, a reason that died with him. The truth is that no one has ever produced a definitive answer because Mitscher destroyed all his personal papers before he died. He left no memoir, no journal, no private account of that morning. What he left was the record, and the silence around it. Mitscher was quietly reassigned. No formal inquiry, no public announcement. The carrier command he had spent his career working toward was taken from him, and he was sent ashore to the Solomon Islands to coordinate land-based air operations from a runway in the jungle. He packed up and went. No explanation to anyone, no complaint on the record. The Solomon Islands in 1943 were not a place a man went to rebuild a reputation. Guadalcanal had just been taken back from the Japanese after 6 months of grinding, brutal fighting on the ground and in the water around it. The airfield there, Henderson Field, was a strip of red dirt carved out of the jungle. The planes parked under the trees to hide them from Japanese bombers. The heat sat on everything, all day, every day, the kind of equatorial weight that makes a man feel like he is working against the air itself. The Japanese still controlled the sky to the north, and pilots flew missions every morning knowing they might not come back by afternoon. When they didn't come back, Mitscher read the reports. He ran the air operations as commander aircraft, Solomons, Commercials, no carriers, no fleet, no headlines. His domain was a collection of airstrips and jungle clearings and a chain of command pieced together from Navy, Marines, Army Air Forces, even New Zealand and Australian squadrons. All of it held together by logistics and improvisation and the daily work of keeping aircraft in the air. The men who served under him in those months described the same quality that Burke would put into one sentence a year later. He never lost a man he didn't have to lose. When a pilot went down over the water, Mitscher had rescue aircraft out looking for him before the rest of the squadron had finished landing. When spare parts were slow through the supply chain, he found another way. When the Army Air Forces had drop tanks sitting in a warehouse, waiting for paperwork to catch up to reality, Mitscher pushed through the bureaucracy personally until those tanks moved. The pilots noticed. They always noticed. Nobody in Washington was paying attention to him. In April of 1943, American cryptanalysts decoded a message that landed on the desk of Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. It was the travel itinerary of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the man who had designed the attack on Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto was planning an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomons. His route, his timing, his stops, all of it in the intercept. Nimitz passed the order to Halsey. Halsey passed it to Mitscher. Yamamoto would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville, 315 miles. Not one Navy or Marine fighter at Guadalcanal had the range to make that intercept. The only aircraft that could reach Bougainville and get back were the Army Air Force's P-38 Lightnings, which had recently arrived at Kukum Field on Guadalcanal with their long-range drop tanks. On the morning of April 18, 1943, 18 P-38s took off and flew 600 miles in a wide arc around the southern perimeter of Japanese radar coverage. They hit the intercept point over Bougainville exactly as planned at 9:35 in the morning. Exactly on time. Yamamoto's aircraft went down in the jungle. The pilots who flew the mission were told to credit Australian coast watchers, a cover story to protect the intelligence source. No press statement, no ceremony. The story stayed quiet for months. Mitscher went back to work. In January 1944, he received orders transferring him to command of Task Force 58. 15 carriers, more than 900 aircraft, the largest carrier force ever assembled under a single commander in the history of naval warfare. He came back to sea without fanfare. He found his chair on the bridge, and the war continued. June 19, 1944, the Japanese fleet had come out to fight. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa had built his entire battle plan, Operation A-Go, around one idea: use land-based aircraft from Guam and the Marianas to extend his striking range beyond what American carriers could reach, hit Task Force 58 from a distance, and destroy the force that was slowly strangling Japan's ability to supply its empire. At dawn, his planes came in the first wave, then the second, then the third, and the fourth. American radar picked them up at 150 miles. The Hellcats were already at altitude, waiting. What followed was not a battle so much as a systematic destruction. The Japanese pilots, many of them undertrained, rushed through flight school to replace the experienced aviators lost in 2 years of Pacific fighting. Flew into the best-prepared carrier air force ever put to sea. American fighters tore through wave after wave. Nearly 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down that day. American pilots flew back to their carriers and joked about it. They called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 2 Japanese carriers were sunk by American submarines before the air battle even reached its peak. Ozawa escaped westward with 35 aircraft left on 6 carriers. That evening, Mitscher turned to Burke. The enemy fleet has not been sunk. Then he went quiet. He sat in his chair. He waited. The next afternoon, June 20th, 1944, at 4 o'clock, a search plane found Ozawa's fleet 275 miles to the west. Burke did the math immediately. If Mitscher launched a strike right now, the aircraft would reach the Japanese fleet around sunset. The return flight would be in complete darkness. Many of the pilots would run out of fuel before they found the task force. Some would go into the water. There was no order from Spruance authorizing a strike. This was Mitscher's call alone. He stood up from his chair. The men on the bridge who knew him noticed. He rarely stood up. Launch the deckload strike. 216 aircraft lifted off the carriers of Task Force 58 and flew west into the failing light. They found the Japanese fleet near sundown. The carrier Hio took multiple torpedo hits and went down. The Zuikaku and Chiyoda were hit and damaged. Ozawa turned his remaining ships west and ran. He had known it was over since the morning of the 19th, when the first waves went in and didn't come back. The evening of the 20th only confirmed it. The American pilots did not know any of that. They turned east in the dark. The fuel gauges were moving the wrong direction. The night was overcast. No moon, no stars, nothing to navigate by. Some pilots had been in the air for more than 4 hours. Some were calculating how long they had left before the engines quit. Some had already picked a spot on the water to go down. On the flag bridge of the USS Lexington, Burke told Mitscher what they both already knew. Japanese submarines were operating in the area. Standing orders were absolute. No lights outside the hull after dark. Not a running light, not a flashlight, nothing that could be seen from the water. Mitscher sat for a moment. Then he spoke. "Turn on the lights." No elaboration, no discussion, no request for confirmation from anyone up the chain of command. One by one, the ships of Task Force 58 lit up. Searchlights pointed straight up into the overcast sky. Flight deck lights came on. Running lights, signal lights, every light on every ship in the task force. More than 100 vessels spread across miles of open ocean, all of it blazing into the Pacific night. In the cockpits overhead, pilots who were preparing to ditch looked down through the clouds and saw it. One pilot described it later as looking like a big city at night. Another said it looked like Coney Island on the 4th of July. Some of them wept. Some of them had already decided they were going to die, and then the lights came on, and they were not going to die. 80 aircraft made emergency landings or went into the water that night. 49 pilots and aircrew did not come home. That number was the price of launching at dusk, not the price of the lights. If Mitscher had held to the blackout, the men coming back to a dark ocean in empty fuel tanks would have multiplied that number many times over. After it was over, Mitscher sat back down. He did not speak about the lights that night, or the next morning, or ever. By October of 1944, Spruance had rotated out, and Halsey had taken command of the fleet. Task Force 58 became Task Force 38. Same ships, same pilots, different man at the top. Halsey was the kind of officer the newspapers loved, aggressive, decisive, ready to fight. America had needed that quality badly in the dark months after Pearl Harbor, when Halsey was one of the few senior officers willing to take the war to the Japanese before the country had the means to do it right. The men who served under him in 1942 would not have traded him for anyone. The country had made him a hero, and he carried it like something earned. Ozawa looked at what he had left. 6 carriers with almost no aircraft. He could not fight a straight engagement, not against Task Force 38. But he could be seen. He could wave a flag and run north. And if Halsey was the man everyone said he was, Ozawa could pull him out of position like a hand pulling a nail. The entire Japanese plan for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Operation Shogo, was built on that single assumption. While Halsey chased carriers north, Admiral Kurita would bring the most powerful surface fleet Japan could still assemble through San Bernardino Strait from the west, come around behind the American landing force, and destroy the transports sitting in Leyte Gulf. Without the transports, the men already ashore on Leyte had no ammunition, no food, no reinforcement. Without the transports, the operation that MacArthur had built his promise to the Philippines around would come apart on a beach. It required Halsey to do exactly one thing: take the bait. On the evening of October 24th, Ozawa deliberately let himself be found. Halsey took the bait. He ordered Task Force 38, all of it, every carrier, every ship, north after Ozawa. He issued orders directly to the carrier group commanders, stepping past Mitscher without a word. Not out of malice. That was simply how Halsey operated. Directly, quickly, with no steps between the idea and the order. It was the second time in the war that Mitscher had watched a superior officer reach past him in the middle of a major engagement. He turned to Burke. "Admiral Halsey is in command now." Then he went to his cabin and went to sleep. Burke and the staff stayed at their stations through the night. The reports came in piece by piece. Kurita's fleet, built around the Yamato, the largest battleship ever put to sea, with 18-inch guns that could reach a target at more than 20 miles, had come through San Bernardino Strait exactly as planned. Ahead of them, covering the northern approaches to Leyte Gulf, was a group of escort carriers and destroyers called Taffy 3. These were not fleet carriers. They were slow, thin-hulled ships built on cargo hulls, assigned to support amphibious operations. Their aircraft carried depth charges because anti-submarine work was the mission they had trained for. The destroyers with them displaced about 1/10 the tonnage of a Japanese heavy cruiser. They were never supposed to fight a surface battle. Kurita found them anyway. The destroyers of Taffy 3 turned and charged. Destroyers against battleships. They laid smoke, fired torpedoes, and the pilots flew their planes at capital ships with whatever they had aboard: depth charges, general-purpose bombs, empty guns. When the ammunition ran out, some of them made dry runs, coming in without anything at all, just to keep the Japanese gunners occupied and the Japanese captains uncertain about what they were facing. Somehow it worked. Kurita turned away. Mitscher did not issue a single order that night. Halsey did not ask for one. The battle ended as an American strategic victory. Kurita withdrew. The landings on Leyte held. Ozawa's carriers went down exactly as Halsey had planned. The Japanese Navy never put a serious fleet to sea again. Taffy 3 paid the bill with its own blood. Nimitz sent Halsey a message demanding to know where Task Force 34 was. The message ended with a phrase added only as padding, random words to confuse Japanese codebreakers that happened to read, "The world wonders." It landed as a rebuke. It became one of the most quoted lines of the Pacific War. Nobody sent anything like that to Mitscher. Nobody asked him about that night at all. In early 1945, Mitscher came back to Task Force 58 for the last campaign, Okinawa. The fleet stayed at sea for 2 months straight, not 2 months with occasional rest at anchor. 2 months of continuous operations, continuous attacks, continuous losses. The kamikaze units had been built into something new and terrible. They came in day and night, in waves week after week, and there was no way to stop all of them. You could only wait for the next one and deal with what it did. The staff watched Mitscher the way you watch someone when you are worried but cannot say anything. He was thinner than he had been. He slept less. The heart condition he had managed for years was not being managed anymore. Nobody said it out loud. On the morning of May 11th, 1945, at 10:02, a Zero came down on the bunker hill at a steep angle and released its bomb before impact. The bomb punched through the flight deck and exploded below. 9 seconds later, a second kamikaze came in from the other side and struck the island. 20 seconds total. 396 men died on the bunker hill that morning. 3 of Mitscher's staff officers, men who had stood beside him from the Philippine Sea, through Leyte Gulf, through the long months since, died in those 20 seconds. Everything in Mitscher's flag cabin was gone. His uniforms, his personal papers, his photographs, everything he had with him. He transferred his flag to the Enterprise. On May 14th, a kamikaze hit the Enterprise. He transferred to the Randolph. 3 flagships in less than 2 weeks. He kept working. The war in the Pacific ended in September 1945. Mitscher came home. The Navy gave him a desk in Washington, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air. A title. A recognition of what he had done across 3 years of the hardest carrier warfare in history. He did not belong behind a desk. Anyone who had seen him on a bridge could tell you that. He died on February 3, 1947. Heart failure. He was 60 years old. He had pushed through the drop tanks and turned on the lights and sent 216 planes into the evening sky and kept working through 3 flagships in 2 weeks and never once asked to be relieved. His body simply ran out. Mitscher signed an after-action report. Spruance wrote that where the 2 accounts disagreed, the Enterprise report should be considered more accurate. Torpedo 8 sent 30 men west over the Pacific. 1 came back. The victory at Midway happened without the Hornet's air group. 1944, June. Mitscher sent 216 planes into the dark. Then he turned on the lights. Japanese submarines were in the water. The pilots came home through tears in their cockpits. 49 did not. 1944, October. Halsey stepped past him. Mitscher turned to his chief of staff and said, "Admiral Halsey is in command now." Then he went to sleep. Taffy 3 fought alone until morning. 3 events, 1 man. Not one public explanation, from the moment any of it happened until the day he died. In 1919, he sat on the wing of a broken airplane in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and waited. He did not know if anyone was coming. He did not know if the fog would lift or the sea would take them before a ship arrived. He waited anyway. A ship found him. 25 years later, 216 men were somewhere above him in the dark over the Pacific. Fuel gauges dropping toward empty, no horizon, no lights below, no way to know what was waiting for them down there, or whether anyone was even looking. He turned on the lights. That is what we know. The reasons, the full measure of the man, the weight of everything else. He did not leave that for us to have. He left it with him when he went. Arleigh Burke lived until 1996. For more than 50 years, in interviews and in writing, and in the quiet conversations that happened between men who served together, Burke was asked about Marc Mitscher, about what kind of officer he was, about what it meant to serve under him, about the decisions, the silences, the long years of the Pacific War. Burke's answer never changed. His flyers worshipped him. That was all he ever said. And if you think about it long enough, if you sit with that sentence and everything it carries, you start to understand that it was not a small thing to say. It was everything. Your grandfather sat across from you at the dinner table. Maybe he talked about it. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he said a name once. A ship, an island, a battle. And you were too young to understand it, and you never thought to ask again. Maybe he sat there and stared at something that wasn't in the room, and you didn't know enough yet to know what questions to ask. Those stories are leaving us now, not because anyone decided they don't matter, but because the men who lived them are gone, and the stories they never wrote down are going with them. If your father or your grandfather served in the Pacific, Navy, Marines, Army Air Corps, write his name in the comments below, his ship, his island, his year. Just write it down somewhere. It won't disappear. Because the stories you heard at that dinner table, the ones that never made it into any history book, the ones that only survived because someone who was there was sitting across from you, those are the ones that tell us who these men actually were. Don't let them go.